The story of Upbuild began in a monastery. On our quest to understand ourselves more deeply, we recognize that it is our attachment to our egos, our identities, that gets in the way of being our true selves. This podcast will help you understand your ego. It will help you better understand your inner world, the motivations, insecurities, and emotions that affect your every action and relationship. Welcome to Upbuilding the Self.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here. I'm Hari Prasad, and I'm with Rasanath. We are discussing today about a subject that Rasanath has brought up many times in the past over the years, and which I noted as highly, highly relevant and something which is already so integral in terms of our philosophy at Upbuild. It's very integral, but he has a coining that I think is super, super helpful and a lot of insights that I'm looking forward to unpacking. And the subject is the Inspiration-Insecurity Continuum. The Inspiration-Insecurity Continuum. So I want to first start out with a question, naturally. What is the Inspiration-Insecurity Continuum, Rasanath?
Thank you. This is a topic very close to our hearts, as you said. And I must say the phrase Inspiration-Insecurity Continuum was designed to make it sound really cool. Let's just get that. Also, I think it popped up very organically.
Yes, I remember that.
And I found myself admiring myself for how that phrase came about.
I love this reveal. Even I did not know that that's what you were feeling. That was some of the motivation behind the coining. That's exemplary honesty and vulnerability, which I think is coming from inspiration.
Thank you. And the idea behind it was to demonstrate how complex our decision-making process is and how externally we portray so many of that. So what the Inspiration-Insecurity Continuum is to gauge whether our decision and our actions are coming from a place of insecurity or are they coming from a place of inspiration. And many times it's a mix between the two. And there is a whole spectrum where it can go from, if we were to categorize the insecurity, the darkest part of it as like black and dark, to the brighter parts, which is, coming from pure inspiration and that being like fully bright. There are so many different shades of gray. And that's the continuum here, where our actions are coming from some combination of inspiration and insecurity. Now, here's where it gets tricky, which is why this phrasing, I think, was important. Many times in our decision-making or in our portraying of, our decisions, in the projection of our decisions, especially if you're leading a company or even if like we are the head of a household, there is a way in which we can project our decisions coming from a place of insecurity and disguise it as coming from a place of inspiration. And that's where it gets really tricky. When we take the minor part of the emotion, which might be inspiration, this is not to say that there is no inspiration, but it may be smaller, much smaller sometimes than the insecurity. And we somehow take that part and project that as the real reason for a decision versus really coming in touch with insecurity. So that's what this spectrum really helps us introspect and understand. Where is a decision truly coming from? Where am I emotionally operating on that spectrum? And the first step is to be honest about it. And the second step is, and this is the real work, how do you still move really close to the place of inspiration so that your decisions come from there?
So there's a spectrum between the poles of insecurity at the more negative feeling end and inspiration at the more positive feeling end. And there's all this gray in between, and we can have mixed motivations. I'm insecure and I'm inspired, and one maybe trumps the other, maybe they're neck and neck. And the idea here is we want to get clear about what's going on both sides, how they're interacting with each other, what's the effect on us and the effect on other people when we act out of inspiration, insecurity, or some combination of both. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. I remember very distinctly when I started my career on Wall Street, the timing of all of that and going into my career in Wall Street, it was during the time of the financial crisis in 2007. And I remember when I started my job, we had the CEO of our bank address the incoming associates in investment banking. And he started off the talk by giving such an impassioned speech about how this is the best time in the market and that we are in absolutely the right place that we needed to be. And everybody clapped. And I felt, even during that time, I didn't have a vocabulary to clearly state what I was feeling. I felt that there was something missing in that impassioned speech. And I couldn't name what it was. But something felt that there was some sort of overcompensation happening in that talk for what was actually not being spoken about, which was the insecurity around, well, what is to come and how are we going to deal with it? So this is just one example of how we can disguise coming from insecurity. And my sense is at that time in the banking industry, nobody knew where this was going. Some people had a sense that this was going down. And they were also afraid of what it would mean to actually say it that way, because that would create panic and perhaps even losing talent to a competitor bank. So there was just this projection of confidence. And there was also statements like, well, other banks may experience a collapse, but we are so much better positioned, right? But reality later on showed something very different.
And so what you're observing here is that there was some insecurity on the part of the speaker around the potential for the financial collapse, that things were not adding up. And so instead of being honest about that or being humbled or trying to troubleshoot or do something constructive with that reality, it became an overcompensation where it's like, to combat that, I'm just going to project higher confidence as if it will squash the reality somehow.
Right.
So it's an avoidance. It's sort of like overpowering a negative emotion with a positive emotion,
right?
Thinking that somehow that will allow me to escape the negative emotion.
That's right. That's exactly it. Thank you.
So I was going to ask you, what's the benefit of knowing whether we're coming from inspiration, insecurity, or both? But I think laden into what we just unearthed here, you can see a lot. Can you say more about that? What's the benefit of being able to see what we're avoiding when we disguise insecurity as inspiration, or we're not yet clear about where we fall on the spectrum?
There are so many examples that I can give in my own life about how that kind of avoidance always comes back to that you will have to actually deal with it. And sometimes the fact that you've avoided it, we are avoiding things in the hopes that, one, people will not see what we're experiencing. The second is that eventually it will go away so that it never needs to be seen, right? Those are the two broad, unconscious responses that are fueling avoidance. And when I said in my own life, I've experienced this, I became a monk at one point in time in my life. And while I also spoke a lot about the calling behind becoming a monk, I also later on in my life really understood what I was avoiding also when I became a monk. And what I was avoiding was to see the pain of death and dying, to understand how to live very closely with a loved one and eventually lose the person. And that was actually a very painful experience for me. I just wanted to avoid that at all cost. So there were still elements of avoidance in my decision, but it was not very clear until a time when I had to really look at that avoidance and understand that I can avoid it no longer.
And what would you have done if you had the foresight to see that, hey, yes, I have an inspiration to become a monk, but I also have this insecurity around confronting the harsh realities of life. And I feel like the monastic life can shield me from that, but I'm not willing to deal with it right now. Let's say you had the wisdom and the courage to face that insecurity. what would it have looked like? What would you have done differently?
The challenge, and this is, I can try to diagrammatically represent what is happening when we don't look at the inspiring parts and the insecure parts. When we choose, and typically in this realm, we are talking about going in the direction of inspiration and projecting and overcompensating on the side of inspiration, there tends to be a polarization that happens. We sort of separate the insecurity and the inspiring pieces, kind of hide the insecure pieces, and become attached to the story around the inspiring piece. When we become attached to the story around the inspiring piece, the ego takes hold because it becomes attached to the identity of that story. Now, the insecurity is not going anywhere. It's still in the system. I've just artificially sort of polarized it. And it shows up. It shows up in your life. And eventually, it can show up in a much bigger way over time.
Well, it's also showing up as the overcompensation.
It is.
So it can leak out in other ways. Definitely. As like a more direct experience of insecurity. And you can see some of the harm in that. But there's also leaking out and harm in the overcompensation itself that looks like inspiration, because now you're playing up something that isn't very real.
Absolutely, absolutely. And others can feel it, but they may not necessarily be able to put their pulse on what exactly is happening. And for us, and going back to your question around what would I have done differently, I think for me specifically around if I had brought my insecurities along, my inspiration, one, the story would have looked very different. I'm not projecting this ideal, inspiring image to everybody and becoming attached to that story, which when we become attached to the story, it makes it really difficult for us to step off of that story, especially when we have to confront our insecurities. So I remember in my own life when I had to eventually decide that I had to leave the monastery. And one of the things that I had to really look at was the insecurity around living alone and experiencing death of loved ones. The story around, at least the story in my mind around becoming a monk was, I've given up everything of this material world. And I have decided to dedicate my life to this higher cause, which was true. And alongside that was also the avoidance of what I did not want to look at. And at a certain time, when I had to look at it very strongly, it was painful because one of the biggest things that I had to let go was an identity around a story that I had made this decision purely based on inspiration and the idea of, oh my gosh, how did you leave the world behind? You were so selfless, and all of those things and the self-narrative around all of that were suddenly dismantled. And that was painful.
But that sounds healthy also. That's important.
Yes, and I also know I couldn't have done that without help, because I had the help around you where you witnessed it very closely. So you were essentially like my spotter during that time. And I can also say that for a lot of people, that process of transition or owning the parts that they had avoided can be so difficult because it means a complete dismantling of an identity that they have built for themselves around the inspiring parts of the story. And they have also projected it on the world. So that's what the world is seeing and validating.
I was thinking exactly along the same line. Before you shared this, I was really thinking very similarly that the most dangerous thing is not even our impact on other people at this point. The most dangerous thing here is our investment in the ego that strengthens it and strengthens it and strengthens it. When we identify with the inspiration and we blow it up, then we are locking ourselves in the stories of the ego, which keep us in the prison of the ego. That's the method of ensnaring us, is with these stories. And so then we never get to who we really are. And it's all this smoke and mirrors around who I think I should be, how we define the ego at Upbuild, which is the very blocker of our being our best, of our being our real self.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also as a direct byproduct of that, the collateral damage that's created. Right now, we step into a territory of what you can say manipulation, which is you tell people a story that they really have to buy into. And they buy into the story, and they may buy into the story because, some may buy into that story because they find it truly inspiring. It touches their heart, partially because of naivete too, right? And some people may buy into the story because they're desperate to buy into a story. But eventually you perpetrate this cycle where when somebody buys into that story and they become attached to that story, then they in turn have to keep that story alive. Otherwise, what does it mean about them, right? So now it's like a transmission across the board where it's a complete hall of mirrors. And on a mass level, there is the avoidance of insecurity, the projection of inspiration, and the attachment to a story that may be so far from the truth.
Right. Rather than creating cultures where the self can thrive, you're now creating cultures where the ego can thrive. And you're spreading, instead of spreading self-realization, which is our mission at Upbuild, we're spreading ego identification.
Right.
And that is very, very gloomy. And the reason why the investment in the ego is even more dangerous than the manipulation of others is because that's the root cause. I can't manipulate other people if I'm not locked in my ego. Because if I'm in touch with who I really am, that won't happen. It cannot, by definition. So I have to look at the root cause, that what allows me to deceive myself and project or overcompensate or manipulate other people is giving the ego this kind of reign over me, giving it the license.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to your point about earlier, you had mentioned how it actually strengthens the ego. The way I think about it is when the ego is strong, it actually embraces the insecurity. What happens is it strengthens the binding of the ego. It strengthens the imprisonment that we experience being in the shackles of the ego. But if we are not dealing with the insecurities, our ego is only more fragile than it's ever been. And it's only a matter of time before that actually cracks.
Yeah, this is great. And the distinction here is the way that I was using strong is in terms of power.
That's right. Yes.
The power of the ego increases.
Yes, that's right.
And that's what we don't want. And the irony is, this is the paradox, that the weaker the ego actually is, the stronger of a hold it has on us. I mean, that's a whole other subject that we could go into, but I think from here, what I'm seeing very clearly, and this was occurring to me even before we started this conversation, and it's amply clearer through this discussion, that we're not so worried about the inspiration being disguised as insecurity. We're not so worried about the inspiration side of the spectrum, what to speak of it being disguised as insecurity. It seems that there's something around inspiration we're defining inspiration as coming from the self.
Right.
So if it's real inspiration, if it has such weight to it, if it has such gravity and impact, it can only be coming from the self. Otherwise, it's some kind of refraction that is probably coming from insecurity or including insecurity. And so we're not so worried about inspiration being disguised as insecurity.
That's true. That's true. What we are worried about is the other way around, insecurity being disguised as inspiration.
So how do you discern this? Because this is crucial. This is crucial to be able to distinguish. And I might say, well, I'm feeling super inspired. I've never felt so inspired in my life. How do I know that that is inspiration from the real self and not some overcompensation or refraction of insecurity?
Inspiration is the thing of the heart. The heart feels it and experiences it when it's there. And it also gets transmitted even without somebody saying, oh, I feel super inspired. When you meet someone who is very genuinely inspired, there is a way in which it moves us. When you also meet someone who's projecting inspiration, it may still be impressive. And this is the distinction that I need to draw, that something that is impressive need not be something that's coming from a place of inspiration.
What about people that are with these very charismatic speakers, and the speaker, I mean, there are gurus of different spiritual orders, there are, positive psychology and new age speakers. This is like across the board in different arenas. You'll see very inspiring, charismatic figures. Some of them can even bring themselves to tears as they're speaking.
Right.
I mean, actors do this all the time, right? And we cry when we're seeing an actor. So how do we know that that's coming from the consciousness of the self, that that's genuine inspiration? Or how do we know that it's not?
So 2 parts here. One part is what is most inspiring is the experience of authenticity. To me, nothing moves someone as the experience of authenticity does, true authenticity. It's paradoxical when you say true authenticity, because authenticity is, by definition, true. And this leads us to the second part of your question, which is, well, what if we can fake authenticity?
Yeah. I mean, people are doing it. Authenticity is a company value with so many of the companies that we work with. And they talk about it. It's a buzzword in the business world, right? How authentic is business actually, including the organizations that propound it and the articles that we read about how you can be more authentic? Is it all super authentic?
Here's the challenge, right? The challenge is that if you haven't tasted real authenticity, if you haven't tasted it, it's easy to fall for a story that looks authentic but is not authentic. Just like if you haven't seen, my guru's guru uses this example quite often. He says that if you go to a jewelry store and if you have no experience of knowing what a real diamond is, separate from a false diamond that shines just like a real one, you would actually say, hey, this is cheaper. So why not take the cheaper one? But it's not the real thing. And for so many of us, myself included in my own life experiences, I have misunderstood what seemed like authentic to real authenticity because I had no experience of what real authenticity was. And in order to find what real authenticity is, there is a price to pay. We have to really look for it. It takes work to look for it. It also takes work for it to look for it within ourselves. But when we do find it, and when we have tasted it, that's when we can actually start to distinguish between what is truly authentic from what is projected authenticity.
Or inspiration in this case, yeah.
Yeah, and tying it back when I said that the most inspiring thing is to experience authenticity, right? That's when you can truly distinguish what is genuine inspiration from what is projected inspiration. It takes for us to experience what genuine inspiration actually feels like.
So if authenticity is the prerequisite for genuine inspiration, and our sense of authenticity is largely skewed by ego representations of it, how do we find the real thing?
The starting point is to spend time with someone who has done the work to be fully authentic. There is really no substitute for this. It is just like when you have to learn any subject, you go to an expert to learn that subject, someone who has done the work to understand and to live. It's the same thing. If you want genuine authenticity, if you want genuine inspiration, if you want to learn how to live by genuine inspiration, then you have to spend time with someone who lives their life from that place. And in observing them, in studying from them and studying them is when we understand how to do that for ourselves. Which is why if you look at any tradition, and especially a spiritual tradition, because I do, in my own experience of spending time in a monastery and following a spiritual path, the basis of spiritual life is authenticity and humility. And when you live with people who live from that place of authenticity, you also begin to understand what it truly tastes like, what genuine inspiration actually tastes like. And from that place, you can start to create that for yourself, and also start to distinguish what genuine inspiration is from what is not.
How will you know when you found it? And there's so much distrust of people that are trying, or some of them claiming to be authentic, right? There's so much distrust, and there's been so much letdown, and there's so much lack of clarity in terms of what this really means. How will you know if you've actually found it? I mean, we experience this in our own lives, right? That it can be hard to trust. And sometimes it's hard for people. We face situations where people don't trust us, and that's painful.
Right. No, it's true. It takes time to understand. That's one thing. It really takes time to understand who is genuinely authentic. You have to really observe the person. And here's the characteristic of a person who is genuinely authentic. During difficult times, and it's during difficult, really testing times, is when the true power of authenticity and inspiration is actually tested. So when somebody's coming out and giving an inspiring speech, we have no real insights into, for example, what are they doing at home when the internet is not shuts down, right? Like, how does that person show up, right? Versus when you really live or really try to study someone who you think is authentic, but you're not really sure, try to study their lives when they go through great difficulty. And then you experience what genuine inspiration and authenticity is. One such person in my own life who I had the chance to, fortunately, be in that location at that time when he was passing away from melanoma cancer was Bhakti Tirtha Swami, an African-American teacher who was a lifelong monk in the Bhakti tradition.
And who we've been speaking about so much. He's been so present in our discussions at our weekly gathering of remembering who we are.
And to actually witness his life from very close quarters when he was passing away for 8 months. He was living in a farm community in Pennsylvania, and I was working in Harrisburg at that time, so I had the opportunity to shuttle back and forth. And at a time in his life where I shudder at the thought of the suffering that someone goes through when they have cancer eating up their body from the inside, and the amount of pain that this person was experiencing. And yet the radiance and the clarity and the power of inspiration that was coming from him transformed the lives of so many people who met him at that time and left an indelible impression that for the rest of my life, I would never. He passed away in 2005. 17 years later, I think about him practically every day, and also think about what it would be like to be in his position. And I shudder at the thought of going through that kind of suffering myself. And yet, the one thing that he said that my teacher also loves to quote, because my teacher, Rasanath Swami, was very close friends with him. He likes to quote this very often. Bhakti Tirtha Swami at that time was saying how it doesn't get better than this. And there was nothing good about his situation. And yet when he said it, we could all feel that it was so real, because what he was experiencing was the freedom, the complete freedom from the ego, even when the body was going through suffering. That didn't mean that his suffering was being hidden, but it was just that he was not trying to compensate for, he genuinely experienced freedom from the ego. And everything that he was sharing was coming from that place.
Perfect inspiration. And even with people that do still have insecurities, I can find levels of inspiration that are so profound by their calling them out, taking responsibility for them, and not acting on it. What to speak of pretending that I'm really coming from a place of inspiration. And that does take a lot of work.
It absolutely does.
And I worry, and I speak about this a lot, and I know you do too, that so much of what our world is putting out, a lot of the inspiration is around giving pep talks to yourself. Pump yourself up, and you can do it. You can be great. You can do anything, just set your mind to it, envision it, manifest it, and you're amazing. Love yourself. You're awesome. And there are certain grains of truth to these things, which can make it very confusing. But that can, and often does, build the ego and not the real self. That often obfuscates the insecurity. It squashes it, like we were talking about in the beginning. It's like, okay, I have this insecurity, but no, damn it, you're good enough. You're great. Just tell yourself and know it and feel it and breathe it. But that's not the work. That's not actually addressing the insecurity at all. That's covering it and trying to pump up the ego to be stronger with the false promise that it will take care of the insecurity. One day, fake it till you make it. One day you'll be that.
So true. Also, going back to what you said earlier about authenticity and it being inspiring, authenticity is not the lack of insecurity, right? Authenticity is the full embracing of insecurity and learning how to be a human being, having a full material experience, which has its faults and its shortcomings. But there is a way in which you're not trying to hide that. And you're also not saying that, well, I have these insecurities, but I don't really care. Everybody's insecure, right? Like that is also compensation. I'm not saying that I have these things and I don't care. I'm just going to rise above. I'm basically saying I am learning the process of walking through my insecurities, and I falter and I fall many times. But I never want to give up the fight. It's in that space that people feel the most inspired, because everybody feels that they are being held back by their own insecurities.
The beauty of what I experience at Upbuild is that it's a place that welcomes our insecurities. You don't have to check them at the door. You don't have to pretend. There's no temptation. I mean, there's all kinds of temptations within my ego, but there's not a temptation in our culture to try to show up with more inspiration or get rid of the insecurities. We want to work through them. We want to become stronger in our real self and in our self-understanding. And so in our coaching of each other and in our team discussions, I will often voice what I'm insecure about, what I'm being challenged by, what makes me feel vulnerable. And I feel so grateful and received in that setting. And I want everybody to feel that. I really want everybody to feel that. So just in closing, is there some word of inspiration, genuine inspiration that we can offer to people to take away from the Inspiration-Insecurity Continuum?
Looking at our decision-making and our story around decision-making, what we tell ourselves and what we tell our people, other people, should be run through the Inspiration-Insecurity Continuum in order to see, well, what part of it is inspiration and what part of it is insecurity. That is where we reach the experience of authenticity in our own lives, which then naturally is inspiring, even when we are not free from insecurities. That's the paradoxical nature of it.
So find yourself on the spectrum and don't pretend.
That's right.
Be authentic about where you are, and that will eventually lead you more towards inspiration, more genuinely for the long run.
That's exactly it. Yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rasanath. This was very, very inspiring to me.
Really appreciate it.
Take good care. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Upbuilding the Self. Upbuild is a leadership development company that offers workshops, coaching, and other services to help you on the path towards being your best self, free from the shackles of the ego. To learn more about our work, visit our website, upbuild.com, and sign up for our newsletter to gain access to podcasts, reflections, and upcoming events. If you enjoyed this episode, please go to iTunes to leave us a review so that others can find and benefit from the podcast. We look forward to being with you again next time.